Good morning. Welcome to the World Dairy Expo and to the Dairy Forage Seminar Series. I'm going to pick this up and get a little bit closer just to make sure you all can hear me. Is the sound okay? Can you all hear? No? Is this any better with a little closer? How about that? All right. So my name is Dennis Hancock. I get to be the Center Director for the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center. We have a location here on campus in Madison. We also have a research unit that's located in central Wisconsin in Marshfield, and we serve the entirety of the dairy forage industry across the United States. We also have a research dairy in Prairie du Sac, just about 45 minutes up the road, where we do most of our feeding trials and animal studies, as well as a number of plot trials and field scale research. And one of the subjects that we have done a lot of work on in concert with UW and Mark, Dr. Renz in particular, has been the subject of interseeding alfalfa into corn silage. And it's been a subject of a lot of interest across the country, and I think you're getting ready to see why. But before I turn it over to Mark, what I want to point out to you, those of you that may have CCA, Certified Crop Advisor, and you need continuing education credits or units, you can sign up for those over here. If you have the app, you can scan in the QR code, and you automatically will get credit for these credit hours for these seminars this week. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mark Renz with UW-Madison, and he's going to be talking about the work that he and others have been working on with interseeding alfalfa into corn silage. So Mark, thanks for being here.
Okay, let's see if this is, I think I'm just going to use this, I'll just use the microphone. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak. I am not an agronomist. I'm actually a weed scientist, but due to the nature of research, I got involved in this effort around 10 years ago, and we've really been excited about the results we found. And I think one of the neat things is, since we've been working on this for an extended time, we feel like this is ready to go and ready to be tried in fields. We've done a lot of time, we've registered products and had other aspects. So I encourage you to think about trying this. I'm going to walk you through the steps of how this works and how we recommend it and some of the benefits of this interseeding practice. But I wanted to make sure and just make everyone aware that we've been working on this for a very long time, well over 10 years, and people have been working on interseeding for decades. But we've made some really key steps forward that really, we feel, make this a viable option, clearly for the upper Midwest and potentially other areas. And we've worked with a lot of other scientists to create this data that I'm going to show you, research support staff, alfalfa and corn seed industry, and had funding from various USDA CRIS funds, USDA NEFA, National Alfalfa Forage Alliance, Midwest Forage Association, and just recently we've gotten funding from our Dairy Innovation Hub, which is in Wisconsin specifically. So we'd like to thank all those funders. I would like to point out John Grabber in the upper right as one of I call him the father of this effort, because he's really been the lead individual that's kind of spearheaded this, and we've supported his efforts. Two other people I'd like to specifically acknowledge is William Osterholtz in the blue shirt. He was our first postdoc and is now a research scientist with USDA ARS. And then next to him is Matt Valenik. He's done the bulk of the planting, measuring, harvesting, all the dirty work too. So as it's no surprise to you, in the northern USA and many dairy areas, we rely on corn silage and alfalfa for our forage as a predominant source. In our neck of the woods, we can, in a good year, get 10 tons of dry matter per acre of corn silage. And that's one of the reasons why we rely on it heavily, and we've been increasing our reliance on that in Wisconsin. Alfalfa is also very important. A well-established alfalfa field in Wisconsin, however, will yield 6 tons of dry matter an acre, although the forage quality is better. However, one of the big challenges is in the seeding year, we have a reduced yield while that alfalfa field gets established, which can be anywhere from 2 to 3 tons of dry matter per acre. And because of that, and because of the risk, we've been having a lot of alfalfa stand failure. We're seeing a lot more people going to the corn side of this equation too. And while corn silage has a very big need and value, there's issues with corn silage that we have in our production system. And one of the issues we have is we have high risk of soil and nutrient runoff and loss. We can mitigate this with a lot of things, and our growers are doing great things with cover crops and other things, but this is a real risk we've been trying to deal with for decades in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. And I'm going to pose to you that we can change our system. And what if we changed our system so instead of on the left it looked like that in the fall in October, it looked like that in the right? We can eliminate and reduce many of those impacts. And that's what this interseeded system does if we do it right. We've actually measured the environmental benefit of this interseeded system to document this. And we kind of did it in a unique way. For those of you not familiar, we have these simulated rainfall enclosure devices that we mimic rainfall events. We actually collect the runoff, and we measure how much soil and nutrients are in that runoff. And so we did this comparing corn silage to this interseeded system, and we measured the reduction in runoff in June, when both of them are growing together, October after we harvest the corn silage, and you see just the alfalfa, and the following spring. And what you see is we're getting a large reduction in runoff, even early when we're just establishing those two crops. Having that alfalfa there dramatically reduces soil runoff and almost eliminates it by the fall and the preceding year. And we see similar results with both nitrogen and phosphorus too. So clearly it has some really good environmental benefits from soil erosion. We can also look at soil nitrate deep in the soil. And what we've done is we've measured this in November after we've harvested the corn. And then we've also measured it the following May. And we're comparing corn only versus corn interseeded with alfalfa. And what you see is in the first, second, and third foot, we're getting about half of the soil residual nitrate by fall when we're using the interseeded system versus the corn-only system. And when we come back the next spring, while there's no difference in the top foot, again, large-scale reductions in that deep soil nitrate levels. So again, another real big benefit, and that's a big issue that we're concerned about, nitrate getting into our groundwater. In addition to these environmental benefits, I'm going to show you some of our data, but we commonly get an increase in forage production when we have this system over 2 years. We see commonly on average a 10% or more increase in the production of corn silage and alfalfa. So that's a real benefit. I'll warn you, for people who like their corn silage, we do some years see a reduction in yield of that corn silage. On average, that's around 8%, and I'll talk about that later. But the real benefit of this system is the alfalfa skips that seeding establishment year yield dip, and we get full production in that second year. So we're doubling that yield. We've done lots of simulations in the profitability of this system, and depending on your crop rotation and other factors, we estimate that it's anywhere from 7 to 15% more profitable. That's including the extra cost for establishment. If we assume the seed cost is all the same, it's around 7% more, around $50 to $75 more per acre for this interseeded system versus the corn-only system followed by alfalfa. We do acknowledge the potential for failure is higher in the system, and we evaluated this in our study and basically found that even with a 90% success rate, so 9 out of 10 fields are successful, it can easily be profitable and even below that success rate. So what I want to do in this presentation today is overview this system and just kind of how it works and do the blueprints of it. talk about our recommendations for establishment. It's intensification of our agricultural system, so it's more work. I'm going to tell you up front, need to do more steps. We'll also talk about some of the lessons learned over the last 10 years of us experimenting with this and some of the obstacles that we're trying to overcome. I'll kind of conclude showing some of our large-scale adoptions. A lot of this stuff initially was small plot trials, and now we're going up to large-scale trials to show it can work on a large scale. And I hope to have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So what are the basics of this system? We're planting alfalfa into the rows in between corn within a week of planting that corn, more or less, is what we're doing. Then as that develops, the alfalfa and the corn, we do things to get that alfalfa to survive underneath that intense, really competitive corn canopy. In mid-June, we've researched spraying a plant growth regulator called prohexadione, a trade name Kudos, registered for use in Wisconsin and Michigan. And then we come back later in late June and apply, if potato leaf hoppers are present, we'll apply an insecticide. And most importantly, our latest finding is the need of a foliar fungicide to deal with those alfalfa foliar diseases. If we do all that right, we harvest that corn silage in early September. This year it was that first week of September. And we come back, and as of now, it looks like this. We have an instant cover crop that's preventing those soil and erosion issues. But the difference between this system and, say, a traditional cover crop is the following year it becomes a crop, and we harvest it over multiple years. And that's the real benefit of this system. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the details of this. One of the things I want to emphasize is that when we do interseed two crops together, alfalfa and corn, we can get a yield loss in the corn. It's variable from year to year. Some years it's 0, some years it's greater than 10%. But on average, over all of our trials, we see it averages around an 8% yield loss. And you can see the pictures of what it is. In years like this year, where we've had considerable drought in the upper Midwest, specifically Wisconsin, our yield loss was greater than 8%. When we have adequate rainfall and we're at the higher end of our nitrogen recommendations, we often get 0% yield loss. But we would like to recommend expecting a small reduction in our corn silage yield loss. But if we can successfully establish that alfalfa, we double that yield. And this picture says it all, if you could see it here. On the left, that's alfalfa that was seeded in the interseeded, and this is the spring afterwards. And we're comparing that to the alfalfa that we seeded that spring. A huge increase in biomass. Over all these years, we easily get a doubling of yield in most years from this interseeded effort because we're skipping that establishment year yield hit. Now, the biggest question that we often get from growers is, oh, that's great, but how long will that alfalfa field establish, and what kind of plant density do we need? We're continuing to study this, but our data suggests that it's anywhere between 12 to 20 plants per square foot are what needed to maximize yield the following year. And as you can see in 2018, clearly this is where this graph will asymptote and level off at 20 plants. And you can see in 2019, it was quite a bit lower. For those of you that are alfalfa connoisseurs, this number is a lot lower than we would expect probably for a first-year alfalfa plant establishment. And so I want to acknowledge that, and further work is ongoing, but this is kind of the target density we're looking for. And my colleague John Graber is continuing to study this to see how many years these interseeded fields can stay in production. So be on the lookout for that data. Our initial results suggest that we can probably keep these fields for definitely 2 years, likely in many cases 3 years, which would be typical to a traditional alfalfa field where you have a seeding year and 3 production years too. So again, very, very similar, but we're ongoing collecting that data. Okay, so what are some of the key basics to think about this system if you want to utilize this? Field characteristics and soil fertility are important. The biggest thing that we recommend is we need to be planting this interseeded system into fields that we would want to plant alfalfa. So we need to have the right pH. That's usually the limitation in many of our areas. We do also recommend having fields that have better drainage versus what we would call a wet field. That has to do with harvesting the corn silage, and we'll talk about that later. Having a good seed bed with not a lot of residue can be important depending how you're planting that alfalfa, because we really want the good seed to soil contact. We have had some issues with brilliant seeders in planting. We have had some success, but I think if you can drill in those seeds, you're going to be better off. As far as fertilization goes, we recommend applying most of the nutrients, how you would apply those for corn silage. We have found that having nitrogen in the upper ranges of the recommendation can be a benefit. And without going into the details, that seedling alfalfa, even though it can create nitrogen, if the nitrogen is available, it'll steal some of it from the corn instead of making it. And so that's one of the things why we find the benefit of being in the upper range. There's some ongoing research trying to optimize nitrogen fertilization. Using a starter fertilizer is also recommended. And really, when we're growing this crop, we have to think about balancing the competition between corn and alfalfa. And my colleague, John Graber, often says, we need to think of corn silage as the companion crop for the alfalfa. And when I give that talk, I tend not to say that to a lot of our corn silage growers because they don't like that analogy. But really, we want to have, if we want to try and minimize that competition between the two to maximize those results. So what we recommend is planting corn at a typical corn silage timing. Usually early May for us is when we're planting it in Wisconsin. 30 rows is where we've experimented. And then we're interseeding that alfalfa in the rows in between, 4 to 5 rows that are less than 6 inches apart, as you'll see in these pictures. Early on, where the corn row is we were not planting alfalfa in that right underneath the corn. Subsequent research found that it doesn't matter if we plant underneath that corn row or not. You can plant the same day the corn and the alfalfa together, or you can delay it. We recommend not delaying it past the V1 stage, and I'll talk about that later. We want to use an early to mid-season hybrid for corn, and the key with that is we want to be able to harvest it by early September. As I'll show you, if we harvest it later, in some of our falls, if we have a short fall, there's not enough time for that alfalfa to regrow. And what we found that in some years, having lower corn populations between 25 and 32,000 plants per acre is really beneficial. As far as alfalfa goes, we recommend seeding it at 16 pounds of pure live seed per acre. And then we have to manage the alfalfa and the corn. As far as alfalfa management goes, the first step is picking the right variety. We found that some varieties do really well in this interseeded system. Alternatively, other varieties do really, really poor in this system. So picking a variety that can do well in this system is highly recommended. You can see some lists of some of the species that we've worked with that we recommend, and we have a fact sheet that you can look at there. We have had issues with some of our root soil-borne disease that affects our roots, particularly in Wisconsin, Aphanomyces. So if you have some soil-borne diseases, we would suggest picking something that's tolerant to that, particularly Aphanomyces. And then some of the work we've done initially was looking at using this growth regulator called prohexadione. The trade name is Kudos. And applying this when that alfalfa is extending its stem anywhere from 4 to 12 inches tall. We found that this can improve the survival of alfalfa in this system. We apply this in Wisconsin around early June, and as I say, there is a label for Wisconsin and Michigan for its use. But there's challenges with this application. Because it is a plant growth regulator and it can regulate the height of corn, you have to direct it over the top of the alfalfa and avoid contact to the corn. So that can be challenging, and it's a very expensive product. It can easily be $40, $50, $60 per acre. So a lot of people don't want to use that cost. I think the other thing with alfalfa management that we need to focus on is we need to continue to fertilize it to maximize that productivity to support the high yield and persistence. One of the things we found in this system is pests can be really challenging. And so this is how I got involved, is weeds were a really big issue. We don't have a lot of herbicides registered for use in corn and alfalfa, and we were having a lot of issues with it impacting establishment. Fortunately, we had this active ingredient called acetochlor, trade name Warrant, is now registered for use in both corn and alfalfa. When that alfalfa emerges, you can apply that, and it'll give you residual control of those annual plants for 1 year, or 1 month, excuse me. And then if you continue to have weeds, you can come back in Roundup Ready systems with an over-the-top application of glyphosate. If you're doing a conventional variety of alfalfa, with some of our excellent varieties are conventional, we'd recommend bromoxynil. Again, with bromoxynil, you need to do it when those weeds are small, 2 to 3 inches, not 2 to 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches in height, so keeping them small. The weakness with that, though, is bromoxynil doesn't control our annual grasses, and so that's an area we're doing some ongoing research with. Another pest that we're concerned about is potato leafhopper. Since we're not harvesting the alfalfa, those populations can grow exponential and really be problematic. We're doing some work on that now, but our recommendation right now is to apply lambda cyclohexrin or Warrior 2 when we start to see nymphs present, because that suggests those insects are going through asexual reproduction and are really starting to increase. That's around mid-July when the corn canopy is closing. And then the biggest information we found is foliar alfalfa diseases are really, really impactful. And so we've been working with Preaxor and applying that in mid to late July, as late as you can. And that's really been a game changer and has given us really good results. And it's very economical compared to the prohexadione. And I just want to point out that having the alfalfa alone is really great weed control in this system. We've actually estimated that just having the alfalfa in this system, if you do nothing else, gives you like 60 to 70% weed control. So a lot of times we don't even need to come back with a post-emergent application, because if we get that alfalfa so well established, it's a good competitor. As far as corn goes, picking varieties that will be ready to harvest early is really the key factor. We're just starting to do some studies to look at which corn varieties work better. Because of the leaf architecture, we think there's going to be differences, but we haven't done that work yet. Again, if you can harvest that early versus later, that will be a benefit. Last week of August, first week of September. Realize, though, that the interseeding system can delay the maturation of that corn silage a week, maybe even a little bit more, so factor that in. And the big issue with corn harvest, and I know this is a hard one to solve, but try not to harvest these corn silage fields when they're wet. And I have a good picture to show you what happens from a cooperator. We got a nice half-inch rainfall event, I think the day before he went in with his corn silage harvester and he harvested those fields. And you could clearly see those ruts that really impacted that alfalfa. Some of it did grow and it did look better, but in wet years, where you can see we can get around up to a 30% reduction in the number of survival of alfalfa plants. So that's a big factor that we need to be on the lookout for, and it's an area of future research that's going on. The good news is if we harvest fields when they're dry, we get no reduction in alfalfa plant density. So that's just one of the caveats we need to be concerned about. But if we do it all correctly, fields can look this good in the fall, right? So it can happen at a large scale, and it has happened. I do want to just kind of pause and let you know that we do have a fact sheet that we've written that kind of highlights the current best management practices. It's on one of our nutrient pest management websites. You can look at it there. If you can't find it, I'd be happy to send you a link. It looks like you guys have the handout, so you can type that in. It has the varieties and everything else available there as well. All right, now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of these key observations that we found that kind of can help you use this system the best. The first thing we found is to number one, when we're planting this alfalfa, use the higher alfalfa seeding rates, 16 pounds of pure live seed per acre, definitely helps in this system. But more importantly, the selecting a variety can really, really be a game changer. When we first started doing this, we were using some of these varieties down here at this end of the spectrum, and you can see they're around a third of the productivity of some of the better varieties. So make sure you select a well-adapted variety for this system, and that's really a critical thing that we found. And now the good news is that Heathcliff Riday with USDA ARS Dairy Forage is actively breeding alfalfa for interseeding systems. And just through one breeding event, as you can see in the green bars, he's seen a significant increase in survival. So we think we can have very quickly have some really good success in breeding alfalfa that's more well adapted to this system. So we're getting good results now. With these better varieties, I can just expect better results over the future. And this is an area we're actively researching. I think the second important discovery that we found is that interseeding can be delayed, and we don't have to do it at the same time as when we are seeding corn. And that in some years can overcome some of the yield loss. And this is some work that John Grabber did at Prairie du Sac, their Dairy Forage's research station. What you see is when we seeded it at planting, we had a significant yield loss of almost 3 to 4 tons. When we seeded it around a week later at VE, we got less corn silage yield loss, and we waited to V2, we had even less corn silage yield loss. So waiting will give corn time to establish and be competitive. And as you can see by the pictures, we had really good establishment in the fall. So we can seed later and get less corn silage yield reduction and the potential to still have good alfalfa field establishment. But here's the problem. What we find is in some years, particularly wet and warm years, we get really, really high corn silage growth, and that is really, really overly competitive with our alfalfa stands. And so when we interseed at corn planting and at VE, we can still get good establishment. In those wet years, if we wait too late, we get failure. And that's why we're really kind of backing off interseeding later and trying to stay from planting to V1 to ensure success. I think the third biggest benefit that we found was that agrochemicals in general really helped these alfalfa survive. You could see here our non-treated control in July. We had tons of alfalfa in this field. By August, it was really common to see a lot of that alfalfa go dormant. But by October, many of those alfalfa plants never regrew and survived. So we had large-scale failure. But if we can apply prohexadione, which is that kudos, this fungicide, which in this case was Preoxor, and insecticide Warrior 2, in the middle of August, we retain a lot of those green leaves, and that helps give us higher levels of success. And just to point out that some of our further work has really shown that it's really the fungicide and insecticide that's really doing the lion's work in here. If you compare kudos alone to these three, you could see that we have much more leaf retention when we have the fungicide and insecticide versus the others. Particularly the fact that kudos can help, but it is so expensive, we think that it may not be practical for every user to utilize it. I think one of the other big challenges that we have with this system is that the environment or the growing season can really affect success. In a quote-unquote typical year in the upper Midwest or Wisconsin, where we have some heat, some rain, but not overly high temperatures or too much rain, what we see is if we don't add any of our cocktail of agrochemicals, we have to really seed at a low corn population to get any alfalfa to persist, and it's tough to be in that acceptable range. But if we add these agrochemicals, we can get really good establishment of alfalfa in that system. and may not need to add all of those. We may only need to add a subset of those. But in the following year, we had this condition where, corn was just growing through the roof, and it was a wet, warm, particularly spring. And those are the years that are prime for challenges for this system. You can see in this year, even at low corn populations, we essentially had no alfalfa. In this case, we really needed these agrochemicals in order to get that alfalfa stand to successfully establish, but they still struggled, particularly at those higher corn populations. And this is why we're recommending those modest corn populations, because we don't know when we plant this, is it going to be a wet or a dry year? At least I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball that predicts weather. So all this work that I've been talking about was small plot work, and we've been giving lots of presentations, and people really wanted to see this on a large scale. So we set up 2 large-scale demonstrations in 2022, one at our Arlington Ag Research Station, which is just about 30 minutes north of here, and then another one in southwestern Wisconsin in a Lancaster Research Station. What we did at the Arlington Station is we compared 3 treatments. One is our business as usual, where corn silage in 2022 and 2023, we planted alfalfa. And we compared that to 2 interseeded systems, one where we had the plant growth regulator, the fungicide and insecticide, to one where we just did the fungicide and insecticide. These plots were 30 feet wide, but 900 feet long. So they were a very large strip. I believe that's around a ½ acre or so. And I want to emphasize these were planted and harvested with field scale equipment. So here's a picture how it looked after planting. Good alfalfa establishment, good corn establishment. All things are looking good. By late June, we have a good competitive crop. Harvested that. Next spring, we had really good alfalfa established. Here's where we're going to plant the alfalfa the next year. Planted it April 28th. And you can again see the difference in growth. And this is how the interseeded looked May 13th. Just beautiful. It's a great stand. Again, if you didn't believe me, we did harvest it with field scale equipment and collected that biomass. You can look over here and see this is the seedling strip that we had out there too. Okay, so what are the results? And I have to thank Marta Coleman for putting together this table. Again, I want to emphasize the 3 treatments. We have our business as usual, traditional corn silage followed by spring seeded alfalfa. When we're doing corn silage, all we did is 2 herbicide passes, so 2 passes through the field. Comparing that to our interseeded system with all 3 of these agrochemicals, that's 4 passes through the field. So it's twice as much passes. 2 herbicide applications, an application for a plant growth regulator, and then one for, we tank mix the insecticide and the disease. We are also comparing that to a system where we did not do the plant growth regulator, but again, that's 3 passes through the system. Our corn silage yield, for whatever reason, was between 7.2 and 7.5 tons of dry matter per acre. So a little bit lower than our typical yield, but no difference really that we saw between those 3 treatments. So again, if we can manage our nutrients and manage the competition, we can get similar corn silage yields. And we had really good alfalfa cover in that fall, as you saw by the pictures, between 55 to 59%. We came back the next spring and counted alfalfa plant density, and we counted the stems, and we had really good stem counts. We saw the benefit of the prohexadione. We had more alfalfa stems, 78 stems per square foot, versus 56 in the one that did not have the kudos. But again, both those are above that minimum threshold, so look good. All right, so what was the yield of alfalfa? In the one where we planted the spring seeded alfalfa in 23, we got 3 cuts, 3.9 tons of dry matter per acre, which is pretty good. The interseeded ones were between 6.9 tons per acre and 7 tons per acre. And I'll just point out, these cuts were on par with the Arlington Ag Research Station's averages for their alfalfa alone plots. So doing the math, Over 2 years, we got a little over 11 tons of dry matter per acre with our traditional system. But with interseeding, we got anywhere from a 27 to 31% increase in productivity. So again, this is where the benefit of this system comes in. I was surprised these numbers were as high as they were. I think in a typical year, we often do see some corn silage penalty, and that's where that percentage drops a bit. Now I want to compare this to the Lancaster Ag Research Station demonstration. Here we can see we use a little bit different treatments that I'll explain in a little bit. Here we can see the interseeded system in June 2022 on the contours. Looking good, lots of corn growth in July. We can look in the canopy, the alfalfa looked really good. When we harvested it, as you can see, alfalfa looked good. We felt really good about those stands going into the fall. But coming back next spring, they looked really bad, right? This is not what we want an established alfalfa field to look like April 23rd. It did rebound and look better as we grew things out, and this is where we seeded the alfalfa in adjacent right there. But as we look at the data, you'll see that we had not an excellent establishment. So at Lancaster, we had the 3 treatments. We were set to be the same at Arlington, and we ran into a little snafu. We have the business as usual treatment. But what happened is that the co-op made a mistake and never got out to spray the fungicide and insecticide. So our treatments became interseeded into corn silage with the plant growth regulator alone versus interseeded with no agrochemicals at all. But we still think it's worth looking at the results. Our corn silage yield was good for some reason. We had higher corn silage yield in our interseeded system versus this. This is atypical of the larger scale, so don't really know how to explain that, but that's what we saw. We had really good alfalfa cover going into the fall in our interseeded system. But what happened is we had some winter killers that happened. There was some heaving of those alfalfa plants as well. And you can see our alfalfa stem count density was very low, around half of what we want it to be. So this is why things look so bad in the spring. We decided to still take yield estimates in the alfalfa, and what we saw in the alfalfa seeded in 2023, we had 2 tons of dry matter per acre. It was 4.6 to 5 in the interseeded system. So I think that's actually pretty good given the low stem count that we did receive. And if we look at our numbers, we're still seeing a pretty substantial increase in yield over that 2 years, 31 to 32%. I will also say that last harvest was quite a bit low because that's when we were in a pretty severe drought in the Lancaster field station. So kind of sum things up, I think these results confirm our small plot research that we can expect to get a modest but a high corn silage yield, somewhere between 7 to 9 tons of dry matter per acre. But our alfalfa yield in both of our studies was doubled, like we saw with the small plots trials. And our 2-year yields were actually higher than we've seen, so that offers some benefit. I will say that the Lancaster low alfalfa stem counts, I think is kind of a testament to how important that fungicide and insecticide application can be. I think we would have had really good survival if we did make those applications. We do have some ongoing field demonstrations at a large scale. In 2023, we initiated at 4 different experiments. We have data from 3 of these. Realized that much of Wisconsin was under a significant drought, so that's going to impact our results. We do have corn silage yield from 3 of those sites. The one in the northwest, which was probably the least affected by drought, we had an 8% corn silage yield reduction from the interseeded. At Arlington, which we had a pretty moderate-sized drought, we had a 26% yield reduction. And at Lancaster, where we had a severe drought, 50% yield reduction of that corn silage. So we can get that under drought years. So I'd like to say, don't plant it if you know you're going to have a drought. But again, the crystal ball is tough to do that. On the good news, though, is in all of these areas we have excellent alfalfa establishment. Alfalfa tends to really dominate the competition in moisture-limited scenarios. So if you do have access to irrigation under drought conditions, it's really important with this interseeded system. We do have some remaining challenges that we're continuing to work on. One of the big ones is looking at this reduction in corn silage yield that you can see in the picture. John Grabber in particular and others are looking at how we can mitigate this with nitrogen application and other components. Competition during drought is another issue that we're concerned about. I think the third issue we're concerned about is what happens like in Lancaster when we get a stand that looks like this. Can we improve it? Should we improve it with alfalfa? So we're going to have allelopathy? Do we need to put in some perennial grasses, or what do we do? And then finally, we are also concerned about harvest damage, particularly in wet years, and how we can overcome that issue. I'm really excited that we have a great team of researchers that are continuing to work on this over 10 years, and we've added some new members to this team that are working on this and had some new funding from Dairy Innovation Hub and other sources to help us continue to improve this method. Heathcliff Rede is looking at improving alfalfa varieties. John Grabber is looking at corn hybrids, fertilizer, planting and harvest management. I'm continuing to look at some of these agrochemical applications and some of the pest management recommendations and thresholds when we need to make those applications. We have Marta Coleman, who's in the audience here, and Brian Luck are going to be looking at wheel traffic damage and how to mitigate that and understand that. And Marta's also starting a trial this month looking at how we fit manure into this system, and can it fit in the same way or different ways. So just kind of sum things up, I think I'm pretty optimistic that if you can follow our management recommendations, this system can be a success to you, and you will see increased yields. Nutrient value will be similar than our traditional systems. I did not show you that data. Profitability can be expected to increase, and you will have a better and improved environmental footprint. So there's lots of reasons to adopt this practice. There are some challenges, and I'd be remiss not to mention that. If you really like high corn silage yields, you're gonna probably not like this system as much. And when you get those high corn silage yields, you can get failure. So failure can happen more common than not. We think it's in that 10% frame with our current techniques. This is going to be more expensive as well. It's going to cost more. It's intensive agricultural production, so it's going to cost more for this system, but the higher yields are offsetting that. I think personally, talking to producers, the biggest obstacle, it takes more time. We're really busy in planting season, and we're going to need to go out to that field after we plant it with corn and come back and plant it with alfalfa. A lot of people don't want to do that. We need to make extra passes to apply a plant growth regulator, to apply a fungicide and insecticide. They may not want to do that. We have to harvest it early. It may not fit with our harvesting schedule. So I think that's going to be a big challenge in adoption for this system, but we're trying to work through some of those issues. I'm optimistic. I think our results and our work over the last 10 years really show that this is really ready for on-farm experimentation, and we'd love to be a part of helping producers or clients in fitting this into their system, how they best see fit. We're actually looking to write some more some more funding to support this. So if you want to try this system, pick a suitable field, follow our recommendations. I always get a good laugh when we talk to people and they say, we tried it, didn't work. And then we ask them, well, did you do what we asked? And they said, well, that was too hard, so we just didn't follow your directions. Well, that's probably why it didn't work. I think in particular, the harvest timing is important. Picking the right alfalfa varieties are important, and keeping those seeding rates of corn at a modest application. Managing pests as needed is also important. We have the benefit that we do have tools labeled for use that can be used in this system too, so that's a real benefit. And again, a lot of it's laid out in here. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer more of those questions. With that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and hopefully I do have some time for questions. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions if you'd like to ask.
Yeah, Fee. Yeah, so the question was, will a brilliant seeder work? The answer is yes. Yes, a brilliant seeder will work. It just has, you have to make sure you get good seed to soil contact, and having less residue is important. If you have a lot of residue, that's when the brilliant seeder doesn't work in general really well. So yes, it will work. We've just had more variable results with some of our fields that have had minor residue issues. Other questions? Yeah, Mike.
Yeah. Shouldn't the yield comparisons be made over more years than just two?
Yeah, so Mike's question is, should the yield comparisons been made over the whole cropping system, not just the first 2 years? Yes, they should. And we are doing that now and collecting that and assembling that. I can just tell you, Mike, is when we've looked at those data, after that, if we're successful in establishing it and we have an adequate stem density or plant density above threshold, those fields behave exactly like the seeding your alfalfa too. I think the big question I have is, could we get, some years in Wisconsin, we will get a 5th year if our alfalfa stands stay productive. And I'm not as optimistic we'd get that 5th year in this system. But yes, they do need to be compared over the entire rotation. Our profitability modeling work did look at like 6 or 7 different crop rotations over spanning 6 years. So we did look at that at our profitability stuff. But yes, you're right, Mike, we do need to do that. That's just a lot more work.
Mark, I've got a question for you. So typically we want to have at least 2 years of alfalfa before we go back to corn silage. What's your thoughts on whether or not we can have a year of corn silage with the alfalfa, a year of alfalfa, and then go back to corn silage again?
Yeah, so the question was, is in this interseeded system, we'd have interseeding in 1 year, we'd have harvest the alfalfa the 2nd year, and then the 3rd year, we'd terminate the alfalfa and go back to corn silage. We did look at that in our profitability margin, and I think that is a viable option. I think the challenge is if you have alfalfa at an acceptable threshold in plant population, you're still going to get that 6 tons per acre. So it probably becomes more of, do you want more corn silage or do you want more alfalfa? And then you have the nitrogen issue too. So I think from a profitability standpoint, if that alfalfa field's at full production still, I would say no, it doesn't make sense. But it clearly is an option. Yeah, Mike.
So let's say you have a damaged stand, whatever reason, wheel crack or weather, whatever. Can we interseed alfalfa in that stand? Is seeding going to be
Right.
a problem, not a problem, or competition, or
Yeah, so the question is, what if we have a damaged stand that is below that acceptable threshold? What do we do? Can we interseed allelopathy? We haven't done the work, so we just don't know. So I could guess, but I don't know. I think we need to do it and see. My guess is we probably could get that alfalfa in, but that's just a pure guess. I think I'd probably lean first to planting a perennial grass in there would be my thought. I don't know. What do you think, Mike? It's a good question. We just haven't done the research yet.
Well, I think probably where you have just bare ground, I think it's probably okay. Now, when you just see wheel tracks, I
Yeah.
don't know how good that's going to be. And I don't know how popular going in there with grass is going to be.
Right.
At least
Yep. Yeah. So that's one of the challenges too. So I think that's something we need to do is to figure out what to do if you have that stand, because you have all that money invested. You need to still get it through, and you're not going to know that result till May anyways. It makes sense to supplement it. Maybe it's like an Italian ryegrass or oats or something just to give it for that year, that added boost. But that's an experiment we need to do.
I do think it's kind of good news that you're saying the plant growth regulator isn't as important,
Right.
because I think that was a big hitch in this whole system.
That's exactly right. Right, right. People weren't willing to want to apply it because you needed specialized equipment, and it was just so expensive too. Yeah. Yeah. So Tom was asking if we've looked at it at areas that weren't flat. So all the data I showed you on the nutrient and erosion was at Lancaster, and so that was on a sloped field. It wasn't a 10-degree slope, but it was a sloped field. So we have done work at Lancaster, and we have done work at other areas that do have some sort of slope to it. We haven't done anything on super steep slopes, but it appears to work just as well in those areas. The data that I showed you on the erosion was from Lancaster. It was a 1 or 2% slope in that field, maybe 3. So there was some slope, but it wasn't excessive.
I think we better cut it off there. Let's give Mark a round of applause for a great presentation. I did want to point out that there is the handout that he was talking about, the publication that they came out with is back on a table back in our booth area. So if you'd like to pick that up. And while I'm here, I'd also like to introduce a couple new faces to the forage industry. Marta Coleman is a extension agronomist and forage specialist with UW-Madison. And then Scott Newell is also with UW-Madison, UW Extension. He is our national alfalfa agronomist. So he covers all aspects of alfalfa. So get Marta and Scott off to the side and quiz them and see what they're worth. But we appreciate them being here. And again, pick up a copy of this recommendation. And if you are a CCA member, don't forget to sign in back here so that we can give you credit for your credit hours. With that, we'll see you at 1:30 for our afternoon seminar. Thanks.